Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world today. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse Webinar. I'm Lindsay Villasina, and I'll be your host today. And today I have Mary Iqbal here, and she is going to present to you how the Scrum Values can help you practice professional Scrum. So looking forward to this fun talk, and let's get things started. So next slide, please. Okay, so just some really quick guidelines here. Your microphone will be muted throughout in this session. However, we want you to ask as many questions as you have. I just ask that you please put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you do want to utilize the chat, utilize that for the exercises that Mary plans on doing with you throughout the session. And try to keep your questions in that Q&A box so that we don't get things confused. So please do that. And if you have technical questions, feel free to send me a direct message in the chat. Next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit about Scrum.org. We are the home of Scrum, and we were founded by Ken Schwaber in 2009. Our mission is to help people and teams solve complex problems. And we offer training and certification in professional Scrum. And we are always here to help you on your learning journey. We have a lot of free resources on our website, like this webinar and other videos and things like that. So please check those out for your ongoing learning. And I hope today's session helps play a role in your journey with professional Scrum. And with that, I will hand it over to Mary to introduce herself and kick off this great content we have today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Mary Iqbal. I am a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org, and I am also the founder of Rebel Scrum, which offers training and consulting and agile transformation advice. I have over 20 years of experience in program management. And for the last 10 years, whenever I've had a problem that was difficult or complex or high risk, I have turned to Scrum in order to help solve that. I'm currently the Agile Transformation Manager at WPS, where we have over 60 Agile teams, and I provide guidance for those teams in improving their adoption of Scrum. And I'm thrilled to be here with you guys today to talk about the 5 values within Scrum. So for those of you who are not aware, there actually is a Scrum guide. It is available at scrumguides.org. And the Scrum guide describes the events, the artifacts, and the accountabilities of Scrum. But what's important for today's webinar is to talk about the 5 Scrum values. So the Scrum guide does include 5 values, and these values are critically important to being able to not just do Scrum, but have professional Scrum at your organization or wherever you use Scrum in your day-to-day life. The values that we're going to talk about today are focus. And when we say focus, we mean focusing on the work of the sprint. The next value is openness. Being open about the work, being open to feedback, being open to discussing our challenges, being open to trying something new. We're going to talk about respect today, which is we respect each other to be capable, independent people. It's important. Without respect, all of these other values cannot be utilized. Then we have commitment. The Scrum team commits to achieving its goals and supporting each other. Both of those aspects are important. And commitment, I think, is probably the most misunderstood of all 5 of these values. And then finally, we're going to talk about courage. The Scrum team needs to have the courage to do the right thing and to work on the tough problems. Now, why do these values matter, right? It can come across as, do they matter, right? How are these important? It's important because to be effective with Scrum requires more than just following the mechanics of the Scrum guide. It is more than that. To have professional Scrum, we need trust. I like to think of it as, are we pretending to be Agile? Or are we really embodying the framework? Are we really having that mindset? Are we really creating the trust that's necessary for teams that are working in complex environments? We're not doing something repeatable, right? This is not something that we can write up work instructions for. This is not something that we can have a high degree of, we know exactly when this is going to be completed. This is something that requires creativity. It requires complex problem solving, and that environment requires trust. And when these 5 values come to life, right, that is what helps us build that trust. So professional Scrum is something that we talk about a lot at Scrum.org. It is different from just following the Scrum Guide, right? If you have the 5 events, the 3 artifacts, and the 3 accountabilities, you could say that you're doing Scrum, but to have professional Scrum requires mindset, a change in your mindset, having a growth mindset. It requires actually living those 5 values and using those to create trust with our customers, to create trust with each other, and to create trust with our stakeholders and the businesses in which we interact with. It also requires us to be outcome oriented, to talk about measuring value and having ethics, doing what's right in every day of our professional lives. So what I'd like to do today is start by talking about focus. The Scrum Guide mentions focus 11 times. It's extremely important. And the way the Scrum Guide describes focus is the Scrum team's primary focus is on the work of the sprint to make the best possible progress towards goals. So we're focusing on the goals of the team. So during the sprint, there's a lot. Why does focus matter, right? During the sprint, there's a lot of distractions. There's other things that we could be focusing on. There's the purpose of the sprint, right? Is to deliver a done increment which meets the sprint goal. But there's a lot going on. We work in complex environments. We work in environments where less is known, or more is unknown than known. So some of those distractions can be things like ineffective events or high technical debt, or maybe not having a clear product goal that we're all shooting towards, not having a definition of done, so not understanding what's the work that we need to do for every product backlog item before it can be marked as complete. Not having an ordered product backlog, right? The product backlog is always changing, and that's fine, but not having an ordered product backlog going into some of these key events, or product backlog items not right size, they're too big. All of these things can create distractions for the team and can dilute our ability to focus on what matters, which is delivering a done increment which meets the sprint goal. So I want to take a moment and ask you all, what are some of the distractions that you focus or that you receive or that you that you interact with in your day-to-day lives? If you can put that in the chat. Production support, another great one. That's something that needs to be discussed. High technical debt. Low velocity. Meetings upon meetings, right? Not using the Scrum events to their highest ability, right? Going down rabbit holes, sudden priority issues, not meeting the sprint commitments, the sprint goal. Okay, special projects. All right, we're going to hit all of these. Code reviews, dealing with time differences. Okay, heavy workloads. All right, thank you guys. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. We all work in complex environments. And that's why these values matter. Being able to focus on the goals of the sprint, even when all of these other things are going on. So there's some things that we can do to help with that focus. And each one of the accountabilities plays a role with that. So we're going to start by talking about the product owner accountability. But before I get to that, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about why the product owner accountability is so important. So in 1986, the new product development game article was published in the Harvard Business Review. And it talked about the changing way that we need to work in complex environments. This was actually a precursor. It happened before Scrum was first presented. So one of the parts of that article talks about the fact that outstanding performance in the development of new complex products is achieved when teams are fed with objectives, not tasks. We're talking about goals. Don't tell us exactly what or how to do something. Tell us what you want. Give us a goal and let us achieve it. And that's where the product owner comes in. And the product owner provides that focus, that goal that can make sure that we all have something that we're shooting for, right? Without the goal, without the vision, we're like a ship without a rudder. We're kind of going left, we're going right. That product goal, that's one thing that provides a lot of focus for the team. So for example, I had a team several years ago that had a very tough deadline, right? We had a lot to get done. We had a very short amount of time to get it done. And what we really needed was a goal. What is it that we want to achieve? What's the first thing that we want to go for? And then work on that and get that done. And then we can move on to the next one and the next. So it's very important that we have a vision, right? It's the overarching thing that we're shooting for, but then something more specific, which is the product goal. The product goal is part of the product backlog. It's the commitment for the product backlog. And it's the specific thing, it's the guiding star that we're shooting for. So having that goal, understanding clearly, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the thing that we're shooting for now? And then when we either achieve or abandon that, replacing that with our next goal. It's really important, because if you think about delivering in a complex environment, there's a lot of distractions, but with that product goal, we can all be shooting for the same thing. Another way that the product owner can help us, making sure that we improve the focus of the team, is having a clear, concise, ordered product backlog. Coming into those events with a product backlog that has been ordered, and as much as possible is clear and concise. So it's not something that's solely on the product owner to achieve this. This is something that the product owner works with the developers on and the rest of the team to make sure that they have a clear, concise, ordered product backlog. Collaborating, right? A couple of you guys mentioned technical debt. Having fixes for technical debt in the product backlog can help us increase our focus. Collaborating with developers on dependencies, making sure that we're maybe ordering the product backlog if we need to do so by dependencies, working with the developers to make sure that we're sizing those stories, and then being available for questions, making sure that during the sprint, if there are questions that come up, you have agreement with the team on how available you're going to be, and how available and how the team should interact with you for questions that come up during the sprint. And then focusing on an incremental delivery mindset. What's the most valuable thing that we can do next? Let's focus on that and then move on to the next thing. Again, right? It's all about focusing on one thing, getting that done, and then moving on to the next thing. I think there's the real common phrase for this is stop starting and start finishing, right? Get something done and move on to the next thing. The product owner is the one that provides that focus, and that focus is delivered in the sense of the product backlog, right? That list of things that we're going to work on, the single ordered list of things that we're going to work on, provides great deal of focus for the team.
Hey, Mary, before we jump into the Scrum Master, we have some questions that are coming in, and I wanted to throw one of these at you.
Okay.
So this question, I have a technical team with 3 POs as we service multiple business units, and it would be difficult for one PO currently. Any advice on making sure that we all have a clear and concise product backlog?
Okay. So one thing I'm going to call out is it's really important to have that focus that you have a single product owner per team. So when you have 3 product owners per team, it causes a lot of distractions. So it's really important that you take a step back and ask yourselves, what is the product that I'm delivering, right? What are the end-to-end bumpers, if you will, of your product? Start with your customer. How do I define my product? And once you understand clearly what your product is, it's really important that you have a single product owner. It can't be a committee. It's got to be that single voice. I like to think of it as the single voice of the customer. So having those 3 product owners can cause a lot of distraction. Now, that being said, I understand that a single person, it's difficult for them to manage for a large product, all those product backlog items, and making sure that the product backlog is ordered. That's why the product owner is able to delegate. They can delegate the creation of product backlog items. They can delegate even the ordering of individual product backlog items, as long as the single product owner remains accountable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. And if any clarification is needed, feel free to drop that into the Q&A and Mary can address that after the webinar. With that, I think we should move forward, Mary.
All right. So let's talk about the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master's role in increasing the ability of the team to focus on value delivery is coaching the Scrum team in practices, in Scrum practices. So for example, are product backlog items right-sized? Do we have all the clear accountabilities? Do we have the team set up correctly with a single product owner, a Scrum Master, and developers? Does everybody understand their roles, right? Making sure that we understand Scrum practices and we understand the complementary practices that are necessary for our team. And then ensuring that all events are positive, they adhere to the purpose, right? So at the sprint planning meeting, we're planning, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And why are we doing it? So making sure that all the events are used for their correct purpose, and most importantly, are kept within their time box. So we're not spending, 15, 16 hours in sprint planning. We're keeping it within the time box. And then I think I did see this in the Q&A, techniques for creating a product goal. So if your product owner does not have a clear product goal, the Scrum Master can work with them to create one. So finding those techniques for creating a product goal. If you are struggling with creating a product goal, I do recommend the PSPO class, a Professional Scrum Product Owner. We offer a lot of tips and tricks on how to create a great strong vision statement and a great product goal statement. So even if you're a Scrum Master, I do recommend that class because it can help you coach your product owner or the product owner that you're working with. Techniques for product backlog management. Where are we going to keep that product backlog, right? How are we going to make sure that it's transparent? This is something that you as a Scrum Master can help your product owner to create the location, right? And for your product backlog and making sure that individuals can access it. And that's all part of promoting artifact transparency. Do we have a product backlog that's accessible? Do we have a sprint backlog that is usable and well set up? Is there an artifact being delivered each sprint, and is it done? Do we have a clear definition of done? You as a product owner or a Scrum Master has a crucial role in making sure that all of those things that we need to have are set up and they're usable and friendly. Coaching the team in this concept of incremental delivery. So if you think about back to mechanical Scrum versus professional Scrum, there's a difference in mindset that's really important. And you as a Scrum Master can help coach this idea of incremental delivery, which means delivering work that's in smaller pieces, but it's done. So if you think about a web form, let's imagine that you needed to deliver a web form that has 5,000 fields, right? In the old way of working, you might build the database, and then the data integration layer, and then finally the form. But the user doesn't get anything until all 5,000 fields are ready. With incremental delivery, you do this differently. You're approaching your work a little bit differently. So you might build the database, the integration layer, and the form for 5 fields and deliver that, and then move on to the next 5 fields. It's about delivering what's the most valuable thing to do next, rather than trying to figure out where we're going to be in 5 years. Let's talk about what's the next valuable thing to do next, or the most valuable thing to do next, and let's do that. And you as a Scrum Master can coach on this idea of incremental delivery. And that, I think, is the big difference, or one of the big differences between mechanical Scrum. We're doing all the events, we've got the accountabilities, versus professional Scrum, which is a mindset shift. And then removing impediments. At the same time, right, as a Scrum Master, you got to be careful here, right, with removing impediments. Not everything is an impediment. So you need to push this Scrum team wherever possible to remove their own impediments. It's all about coaching the team to become ever more self-managing. And that's an art for the Scrum Master. It's not something that comes easily. It's something that you as a Scrum Master need to grow into over time.
Okay, so we do have more questions that are coming in. Keep them coming, everybody.
Right.
This question here, how should a team handle being without a, actually I meant to ask a different question. So this is a product owner question. So how should a team handle being without a product owner for a limited amount of time?
Great question. So what I would suggest in that case is ask one, if it is a short amount of time, right? Ask one of the Scrum team members to volunteer to take on that accountability for a short amount of time. So it is acceptable for individuals to play more than one role. So it could be that the development member may volunteer to take on that product owner role, and they may enjoy it. They may decide that they want to move to that role permanently. But it's really important that someone be playing that role, because without that accountability, or without the product owner, without somebody playing that accountability, we're going to struggle with focus. It's going to, I don't want to say devolve into chaos, but you've got to have a single voice telling us, here's what's the thing that we're going to do next, a single decider. So my suggestion is ask an individual to volunteer. That can be a developer, it can be a Scrum Master, you can pull someone outside the team, but work together. And it's really important that we find somebody to fill that accountability so that we're not without that focus, even for a short amount of time. We don't want to be a ship without a rudder. We want to make sure that we're going somewhere. And even if it's in the wrong direction, we can adjust course and change, right? We can change every sprint. But if we don't have a rudder or a direction, someone pointing us in the right way, we're not going to get anywhere. So it's really important that somebody volunteer for that.
Okay, Great, thank you. And one more quick one here, a Scrum Master focused question. What does a Scrum Master do if a particular team member is not participating at all in Scrum?
Okay, so if they're not participating at all in Scrum, I would suggest that this is something that we discuss at the retrospective. Take a look and see if, do we have, so there's a couple ways that you can go about that. But number one, discuss this at the retrospective and hold that individual accountable as a team. So one thing you can talk about is, what are our team agreements? Do we have team agreements that cover attendance at the events? But above all, just discuss at the retrospective. And if that's not something that that you feel comfortable with, remember, right? One of the 5 Scrum values that we're going to be talking about today is courage. So have the courage to bring this up, have the courage to put this on the table and talk about it and see what we can do.
Great, thanks, Mary. Okay, let's move on.
All right. All right, so I just want to take a moment and say, particularly for Scrum Masters, that's a lot, right? Coaching the team in Scrum, making sure the events are all positive and adhere to the purpose. That's a lot to do. So remember, you can't do all that at once. I actually worked with a team who took 6 months to transition fully to Scrum, right? Sometimes you gotta take things in stages, right? So you can't do all those things at once. You as the product owner, and actually you as the Scrum Master, need to focus on what's the most pressing matter and focus on that first, and then move on to the next thing. You can't do it all. Pick your battles, right? If the most pressing matter is stories or product backlog items are not sized correctly, then focus on that, and then move on to the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing. And if you take a series of small steps and focus on improving one thing at a time, you won't recognize yourself in 6 months. And that's a promise. Small steps, small improvements are much better than a giant system rewrite or a giant process overhaul. Focus on the most pressing matters and continue to improve one sprint at a time. So finally, I'm going to talk about how developers improve focus. We're still on the focus, right? And we've talked about the product owner, we've talked about the Scrum Master, but how can developers improve focus? The first most important thing is, don't make any changes during the sprint that would risk the sprint goal. So a lot of times for software products, a lot of times when developers in the code, they may find something that they'd like to fix, right? I've had this happen quite a bit. I could just fix this one thing. Remember, the purpose of the sprint is to deliver a done increment that meets the sprint goal. That's what we're focusing on, and that's what matters. Fixing this one thing could cause additional work for the testers. We don't know how much additional testing effort that might entail. It could cause the unknown issues, right, with the code itself. So fixing that one thing could have downstream impacts that we're not aware of. And it also reduces our focus, right? It takes that power away from the product owner who's deciding what they're going to do next and what the team's going to do next. And now all of a sudden the developer's deciding. So don't make these changes that could risk the sprint goal. And then also use our events. Use those events that help us drive focus. So for example, use the daily Scrum. This is the developer's event. It happens every day. Use that daily Scrum to track progress against the sprint goal. It's not just a mechanical meeting. The purpose of that meeting is to increase the likelihood of delivering a done increment that meets the sprint goal. So use that meeting to talk about, how are we doing? What's blocking us? Is anyone struggling? How can we make sure that we're delivering that sprint goal and we're meeting that sprint goal with a done increment every sprint? And then this next one is escalate impediments at least once per day, at least every daily Scrum. Sooner is better, right? I can't tell you how many times before I moved to Scrum that a developer might suffer in silence for weeks working on an issue and they couldn't figure it out. That should never happen with Scrum. At least once a day, if you're having an impediment, you're having an issue, you're struggling with something, have the courage to talk about it and ask your team for help. That's what that daily Scrum is for. The purpose of the daily Scrum, again, is to increase the likelihood of delivering a done increment that meets the sprint goal. And then this last one I think is really overlooked, but super important. I saw this one show up in the chat as a distraction above. Develop a sustainable pace. What that means is don't pull too much work into the sprint. Make sure that you're right sizing your product backlog items. It's not okay to pull in a product backlog item that we know we can't deliver within the sprint. It causes us to not be able to deliver value frequently. It causes a lot of distraction. It causes a lot of churn, right? Take the time in refinement to make sure that our stories, our product backlog items are right sized before we pull them into the sprint, if at all possible.
Okay, so there are lots of questions coming in here. There's a question here about the sprint goal and competing work. So how do you not risk the sprint goal when there are so many support issues to take care of?
Right. So that's a common one that comes up a lot. So the thing to do with those kind of support issues is talk about it and decide with your product owner, how are we going to handle this kind of work? And there's lots of different ways to handle that, but I'll rattle off a couple of options, but ultimately your team needs to decide what you're going to do about this. So one option might be to leave out some capacity in your sprint planning meeting. So for example, if you know that you're going to get about 20 hours worth of work, or about a certain amount of work, leave out a little bit of capacity in your sprint planning meeting. That's one option. Another option would be to there's so many options. That's one option. Another option would be to yes, leave out some capacity, but also when those items come in, have them triaged by your product owner and let them decide whether they want to put that on the sprint backlog or whether they want to ask developers to pull that into the sprint. Ultimately, the developers own the sprint backlog, so you have to be careful with that one. But whatever you do, have the team discuss it and decide, how are we going to handle this kind of work? How are we going to handle this kind of work so that we're minimizing our distractions? Some teams will even have a separate team, right, that works only on KTLO. That's another option. So there's lots of different ways that you can handle this. But whatever you do, discuss it, have an agreement with it, make it transparent as possible, and make it something that you're setting it up in such a way that you're reducing the distractions. Because again, right, the purpose of the sprint is to deliver a done increment. We need to also figure out what's the priority of this KTLO work or this keep the lights on work, and put it together an agreement on how we're going to handle it.
Great, thanks, Mary.
All right, I said this one a lot, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's worth mentioning, right? The purpose of the sprint is to deliver a done increment that meets the sprint goal. That's what we're here for. So all of the roles, all of the accountabilities have a hand in making sure that we're reducing the distractions and improving our focus on the purpose of the sprint, which is to deliver that done increment. So all three of the accountabilities, the product owner, the Scrum Master, developers, have a hand in making sure that we can focus on our goals. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the next of our 5 values, which is, here we go, there, it's not showing up. Oops, commitment. I think of this one as the most misunderstood value of all 5 values. So what the Scrum Guide says is the Scrum team commits to achieving its goals and to supporting each other. What it does not say is, a lot of people think that what this means is at the sprint planning meeting, if we pull in, let's say, 15 product backlog items, a lot of people think that this commitment means that we're committing to deliver all 15 product backlog items. And that's not what this means. We're committing to achieving the sprint goal, because we know that Scrum is used in complex environments where less is known than unknown. So in that situation, things can change. Even with the best amount of refinement coming into the sprint planning meeting, things can change during the sprint. For example, if something takes a lot longer than expected, we have environment issues, whatever those are, we're committing to achieving the sprint goal. So it is okay during the sprint for the developers to renegotiate the content of the sprint backlog item with the product owner, and to remove the lower priority items from the sprint, and just to really focus on those things that are most likely to help us deliver a done increment that meets the sprint goal. So I like to think of this commitment as the most misunderstood value. So if we're not committing to delivering the individual product backlog items that we select at the sprint planning event, what are we committing to? We're committing to the product goal. That's why we're here. That's the goal of the product, whatever that product goal is. We're also committing to delivering a done increment that meets the sprint goal every sprint. That's what we're committing to. And whatever we need to do to achieve that, we need to do that. And then we're committing to helping each other. When somebody selects a product backlog item and they begin work on it, it doesn't mean that they're the ones that are singularly accountable for that product backlog item. The entire Scrum team, the developers as a whole, are accountable for delivering that product backlog item and for delivering an increment, right? An increment of value that meets the sprint goal. So we're accountable for helping each other. That's what we're committing to. I think that's a really important, right, distinction. Now, that being said, right, you want to try and deliver the selected product backlog items, right? But the goal, the purpose of that sprint is to deliver that done increment. So if things happen during the sprint, that's okay. Renegotiate, reevaluate, and focus on what matters, which is delivering that done increment. Questions, comments on that one?
Let's see if there's anything direct to it. Seems like there are lots of questions here, not necessarily directly related to commitment, but there was a series of questions that had come in that kind of ties to this, and a lot of questions came in around what if product owner doesn't have a clear vision and goal? How can the team or the Scrum Master, or how do we deal with this? And that came up a few times in here.
Okay, so it is critically important. So if the product owner does not have a clear vision and goal, I highly recommend that the Scrum Master work with them to help them create that clear vision and that clear goal. And there's a lot of tips that can help us do those. So for example, one of the things I like to use for the vision is an elevator pitch. You can Google that, but an elevator pitch is a very standardized way of writing a product goal. So I take a look at that. There's lots of other tools. As I mentioned before, I highly recommend the PSPO class because it goes into the elevator pitch template and lots of different ways to write product goals, product visions, I mean. And then there's also different tools that you can use to write your product goal as well. So as a Scrum Master, partner with your product owner, help them to create that product vision, product goal, and also share with them the importance of that. On making sure that the Scrum team can focus, making sure that the Scrum team understands what the goal is, so that when they're collaborating with the product owner on the product backlog, they can suggest ideas, right? Other ideas to help us get there. That way, it's not only on the product owner to meet the product goal, it's everybody shooting for it. And I can't tell you how important that is. I had a team, right, just a few years ago, again, right, who also had a difficult goal that they were trying to achieve. But because the product owner was so clear on what it is we're trying to do, the developers were able to come in and give ideas that I really don't think the product owner could have thought of on their own. So when you have a clear goal, when you have a clear vision, you're unlocking the power of the whole team to help you come up with ideas on how to get there. So it's so powerful. And I think, I got to tell you, so overlooked. When we're working with new teams, that's really the first thing we ask is, do you have a clear vision? Do you have a product goal? That's the first thing we focus on. And I think if a lot of Scrum Masters focused on that alone, you'd be able to increase the ability of your teams to deliver value. So can't understate the importance of that.
Great, thank you, Mary. One more that had come in, and we can choose to table this to the end if we would like, but someone had asked for an example of a product goal and a sprint goal.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to make up a product on the fly here. So imagine that I am a Geico, or an insurance company, and my product goal might be to increase sales, for example, of my insurance product. So a sprint goal that could support that might be to update the checkout process to remove an unnecessary step from the checkout process. So it's a clear step towards the product goal. It's not everything, right? That alone may not be all the things I want to do to get to my goal, but it's definitely a step in the direction, right? And the next sprint goal, we might focus on updating our color scheme to be more attractive. Those are the sorts of things that can help us get there. And each one is a step, and it's a step in the right direction. Sometimes we take a step that doesn't get us there, but then we can easily adjust because we're delivering incrementally. So this little image on the screen actually is my analogy of that, right? Each step, each stair is an increment that we've delivered, and each one gets us closer to the product goal. All right, thank you for that question. I appreciate you guys asking such fantastic questions as we're going through here. All right, so the third value that I want to talk about today is openness. And I got to tell you, I love Dilbert and I love this cartoon. So this is actually a cartoon that we talk about in the Scrum.org PSM class, but I've repeated it here because I just think it makes this point so well. So openness, right? We have Wally who comes up to Dilbert and he says, "How's your project coming along?" And Dilbert says, "It's a steaming pile of failure. It's like 15 drunken monkeys with a jigsaw puzzle," right? And when the pointy-haired boss comes along and asks how the project's coming, it's fine, right? And even though I think this is such a perfect example of what we don't want to do with the Scrum. If the team is struggling, right, we want to be transparent about that at the sprint review meeting, for example, and that can be uncomfortable. It can be difficult to work that way. It's a vulnerability, right? And that comes back to trust, right? The trust goes both ways. We need to trust the stakeholders and be open and transparent with us, and they need to trust us and understand that we're going to be open and transparent about these things. So it is a two-way street. The Scrum team and its stakeholders are open about the work and its challenges. Openness is about transparency, right? But it's also about being honest, but it's also about being open to other ideas. For example, and this can be uncomfortable, right? It's definitely uncomfortable. So for example, if I was a developer, being open to the idea that sprint retrospectives are important. They're not a waste of time, right? Right. For newer teams, you might get that a lot. Sprint retrospectives are a waste of time. They're not. And let's try it. Let's try it and see how it goes. And if you do those sprint retrospectives well, you will not recognize yourself in 6 months. So for example, I had a team, many different teams, but this particular team was struggling with product backlog items not being clear. And so this was something that we discussed in the retrospective, and the developers had to say it, right? We understand that, that you're doing your best, but the product backlog items are just not clear. We don't understand what you're asking for. They don't contain enough for us to code from. So in that particular retrospective, the developers volunteered to write all over the product backlog items for the next few sprints so that the product owner could learn what the kind of information that they wanted to see in the product backlog items. So being open to, right, to trying something, try those retrospectives, being open with your feedback at those retrospectives is really important, right? And then from the product owner's perspective, it can be uncomfortable to ask developers for their ideas about what to do next. I know, when I've played that product owner role, sometimes it can be uncomfortable to say, I don't know, right? Do you have any ideas? I know my goal, but I don't know how to achieve it. And that can be really uncomfortable for a product owner. So being open to other ideas and to asking for those ideas. And then from the Scrum Master's perspective, right? Being open to ideas from the developers and from the product owner as well. You don't have to be, even though you are the Scrum Master, right? You don't have to be the only one that's improving the Scrum team. It's a team effort, right? No I in team. So being open to ideas from the developers too. So for example, if the developers want to use flow metrics instead of points for sizing their work or for planning their work, right? So that means when I say flow metrics, what I mean is using things like lead time to plan where we're going to get, looking at our cycle time, not just sizing with points, but actually trying to right size our stories without the use of points. So being open to that can also be something that can be difficult, but really important to improving the efficiency of the team. Because again, it can't be just one person trying to say, I want to get better. It needs to be the whole team. So being open to those ideas can be uncomfortable, but necessary.
Yes, that is so true. There is something that just came in. What if some of the group is always silent? How do you engage them?
That is so difficult, right? So first off, right, letting them know the impact of their silence. Letting them know that, hey, we need to do this together. It's not just me. So just being open and saying, holding them accountable and saying, we need your advice. We need your ideas. We need you to speak up at the retrospective. Another thing that you can do is sometimes it's important to understand why they're being silent. Are they being silent because we haven't actually taken their ideas, for example, in the past, or they've lost faith in the retrospective? And if that's the case, make sure as the Scrum Master that every retrospective results in some ideas, some actionable improvements, and then actually take that action, right? And when the Scrum team sees that we're actually taking those action and acting upon the things that they've come up with, they're going to be a lot more likely to participate in the next retrospective. So try and understand, use some empathy and understand what is it? Why are they not interacting? Is it that they don't believe in Scrum, right? And try and meet them where they're at. So that can be a difficult one, but first off, again, kind of share what their impact is on the team, and then make sure that those retrospectives are really resulting in action items that are being taken, because the team may be losing faith. And it's important that we use those events as they're intended so that we continue to build trust in the process.
Great, thank you.
All right. And our second to last value that we're going to talk about today is respect. Scrum team members respect each other to be capable, independent people and are respected as such by the people with whom they work. So one of the Scrum Masters I used to work with, she said, frequently, assume positive intent, right? When we're working with someone and they give us an idea, or they say, let's try something different, it can be a little scary, right? It can feel like criticism, but assume positive intent. Assume that we're focusing on the problem. And I think that's the first step towards respect, is assuming that somebody is respecting me, right? We're assuming positive intent, because in Scrum, healthy conflict is necessary. We work in complex environments. And in order to problem solve in those environments, we need to be comfortable with some level of conflict, some level of discussion. Because one person alone is fantastic, but two people with ideas, brainstorming and figuring out how we're going to achieve this is even better. So that healthy conflict is necessary. It's necessary coming into sprint planning. It's necessary coming into refinement. It's necessary for every part of the Scrum framework to have that healthy conflict. And in order to have healthy conflict, with the underline under healthy, we need to make sure that we're treating each other with respect. So whatever it is, say it, but say it with kindness, right? Say it, but say it with respect. We can't have that healthy conflict if we're all in sort of a defensive place. Another thing you may consider using, right, to help make sure that we all can know how to treat each other with respect, right, is you may consider a complementary practice of team agreements. So some teams use this. It's a document that is created by the team and owned by the team and can be updated whenever the team chooses to do so. But it's the team agreements. It describes how the team is going to work. So it can include everything from where is our product backlog and what are the rules within which we're going to operate when we update that product backlog, where's the sprint backlog, but it can also include things like, how are we going to handle conflict? How are we going to make sure that we can handle conflict in a productive way that helps us rather than hinders us to meet our goals? So that's one way you can help promote this idea of respect, is talk about how we're going to handle conflict before it happens, right? And then stick to that when it does happen. Another thing you can do is keep events positive. That's something the Scrum Master can help us do, right? Help focus us on the purpose of those events, and let's attack the problem, not the people, right? So keep those events positive. That's something the Scrum Master can help us with and help us facilitate if we need that. And then keep those events within the time box, because that's about respect too. If that daily Scrum is going an hour, that's not very respectful of the people's time, right? It's not something that's conducive to meeting our goals, and it's also not respectful. So keeping those events within the time box is another aspect of respect. And again, as I started this, let's assume positive intent. And that's going to help us treat each other with respect. It's going to help us and earn that respect from others.
Great. One question here directly related. Where's the line between healthy and unhealthy conflict?
So it's a great question. So to me, where the line becomes unhealthy is when we're starting to attack each other. And when teams, there's 5 stages of conflict, right? And the very first stage is when we're starting to have campaign for things, and it's no longer about solving the solution, it's about being right. That's when we start to become the first kind of level of an unhealthy conflict. So when you see that begin to develop, when it's more important for them to be right about this thing than it is to solve that thing, that can be your very first sign of unhealthy conflict. And the way that you can begin to diffuse that is talk about it in the retrospective. Talk about it and talk about the importance of enabling a healthy conflict. And then ask the team, how can we make this conflict more about solving the problems and meeting our goals, and less about being right and being our personal egos. So it's a difficult thing, but my advice to you is talk about that in the retrospective early. Don't let that continue to escalate. The earlier you talk about it and the earlier you kind of nip that in the bud, right, the better it's going to be for you and the better it is going to be for your team.
Great, thanks.
All right. Our final value for today's presentation is courage. Scrum team members have the courage to do the right things, to work on tough problems. And I got to tell you, this is important. It's important to be able to have the courage to say it, right? But to say it with respect. So for example, in those retrospectives in particular, it can be difficult to call out things that we see as wrong, right? So for example, back to my example of the team that was struggling with the product backlog items, right? I work in the Midwest and we're all Midwesternized. And so it was difficult for the developers to say that to the product owner, to say, we're not getting what we need in these product backlog items. What can we do to fix it? Because it can feel for the product owner very, very accusatory, right? My product backlog's not good enough, right? Is that what I'm hearing? But we need to have the courage to say it, even if it can be uncomfortable, but to say it with respect. So I like to think about courage from the perspective of all three accountabilities. So for the developer, courage can take many forms. It can take, for example, if a stakeholder comes to a developer and says, can you do this one thing, right? Having the courage to say, nope, I need you to address the product owner and let them know if you're looking for new features, and that product owner can order their product backlog according to their strategy. So it's very important that the product owners have the courage to say that. And that's not the only way that courage can, I could say, manifest it, or that's not the only way that courage is needed for developers. I think the scariest thing for me that I've seen is developers having the courage to say every day at the daily Scrum what it is that they may be struggling with, right? That can be awkward. That can be something that's a little bit scary. So courage is so important for teams that are working in complex environments, because things are going to happen during the sprint. I couldn't get that thing done. It was harder than I thought. I may need some help. Or I couldn't get that thing done. I thought I knew how, and I didn't. So having the courage to say that. But remember, it's important because the Scrum team, right, is focused on delivering these goals, and the entire team is accountable for meeting the sprint goal, not just an individual. So if you are struggling, don't be afraid to speak up. And then from the product owner's perspective, right, courage is also necessary in our day-to-day and in every situations. One I like to think about is having the courage to order that product backlog in the way that they really think is necessary, and using their own judgment. So sometimes, right, we need to fix some technical debt. We need to maybe upgrade the system, and we may have to delay some features. But having the courage to make the tough choices is really important from the product owner's perspective. The product owner is accountable for maximizing the value of the product resulting from the work of the Scrum team. And that may mean making some difficult choices. It may mean fixing some technical debt, or it may mean, hey, we're going to deliver that feature, or we're going to run that experiment and see if it works. But making those decisions is difficult. But having the courage to make those decisions is important. And then having the courage to collaborate with the developers when you need to, and asking for opinions, being open to feedback from the stakeholders. It's uncomfortable, but we need to have that courage. And then from the Scrum Master's perspective, having the courage to tell managers when they're making decisions that are having an adverse effect on the Scrum team. So having that courage, that's just one of many examples, right? Every single one of these accountabilities has to have courage. And for the Scrum Master, that can mean recommending changes in the way that the rest of the organization interacts with the Scrum team. So that can mean things like, hey, managers, some of those actions that you're having or having an adverse effect on the team's ability to deliver value. Or it can mean, hey, developers, or it can mean participating in the retrospective as an equal. So it can mean calling out things that may not be appropriate, or that they see that are wrong. So it can be a difficult position to be in, but it's important that all three of those accountabilities have the courage to call out those things that they think need to be improved upon. And that can be scary. So I want to take a moment and ask in the chat, if you could, from your perspective, what are the ways in which you have had to exhibit courage on your own teams, in your own day-to-day worlds? I see some questions coming in. Okay, in the same level approach, how to deal with different personalities, extroverts, introverts, positivists, and negativists. So for the extroverts, right? Hearing their feedback. For the introverts, try different ways to do your retrospectives or some of your events. With being remote, I think is a great way for introverts to be able to interact more freely. So things like a shared whiteboard, it can be really important and valuable. All right, so I've got a couple courage examples coming in. I had the courage to tell a manager not to make me the Scrum Master into administrative assistant. Yes, right. So important, right? I had a Scrum Master just recently, and we were talking about this very thing, where in this case, it was slightly different, but it was where the developers were saying, oh, Scrum Master, the product owner has asked us to add this story, this product backlog item. Can you do it, right? And the Scrum Master having the courage to say, no, I think if you're having trouble, let me know, but that's something that's been delegated to you, right? So that can be one way to exhibit courage. Anonymous retros, you're right, can be a way to facilitate courage, but I'm hoping that teams would have the courage to be able to participate in a retrospective. But yeah, anonymous retros have their place on occasion, but for the most part, try and do them where they're not anonymous. People on the teams openly saying things, I don't know. Yes, saying things like, I don't know. Yes, that can be a way to exhibit courage. Another example is, as a Scrum Master, I've had to tell a client's external architect that they could not assign work to individual developers. Well played, right? I agree. That needs to be the product owner's accountability. It can't be somebody from outside the team. I've had the courage to counsel my manager to understand the true impact of their ideas and requests. Very good. For example, telling those managers that velocity is a tool for the team. It's not a tool for measuring the effectiveness of the Scrum team. Rather, it's a planning tool that the Scrum team uses to plan their work and to forecast their work for the next sprint and even over many sprints to come. So thank you all for participating in that. I appreciate that. And, having the courage to share right here on a webinar. So thank you all for participating in that. I appreciate that. All right, so kind of wrapping up the courage conversation, right? Having the courage to promote a clear accountabilities, making sure that the Scrum Master is not an administrative assistant, the product owner's power of ordering the product backlog is respected, and that the developers are focused on the sprint goal, not all these other things. And having the courage to say, nope, that thing needs to go to the product backlog, please address yourself to the product owner. Having the courage to do the right thing. What that is can obviously can depend on the situation, but it can mean having the courage to say, look, I'm struggling with this thing. I'm going to need help. I need to raise this issue now before we get closer to the end of the sprint. And overall, say it, but say it with respect. It needs to be said, but it can be said in such a way that it's not an attack, right? That we're not creating unnecessary conflict and heading straight into unhealthy conflict. So having that courage does not mean being disrespectful. It means I'm going to raise that issue, but I'm going to do it respectfully for my team. So one thing I would like to wrap this up with talking about how can you live these 5 values more effectively in your own Scrum teams day to day. So one thing I highly suggest you do is talk about it in your retrospective, right? With every problem, I think my first response is going to be talk about it in your retrospective, but really talk about this in your retrospective. One activity that I like to do is bring up a shared whiteboard and ask the teams, how can we more fully live these values as part of our own Scrum team? And then ask them to put sticky notes, or if you're in person, you can put it up on a whiteboard, but have the conversation in whatever way feels best to you. But really ask the team, how can we live these values? And then once they've brainstormed the different ideas and the different ideas that we can use to live each one of these values, ask them to vote on one. And let's do that in the next sprint. Let's actually do that in the next sprint. Because back to one of our earlier questions, if teams are not participating in the retro, the worst thing you can do is come up with ideas and then just not do them, right? So come up with some ideas and do those in your next sprint. And whether that means putting it on your sprint backlog for the next sprint or putting it somewhere else, or taking action immediately, whatever that means for your team, but definitely take action on one of these things. I think it's a valuable discussion, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the results of that. Every time I've done this activity, it's been appreciated, and it's been something that folks participate in and then actually act upon. So I highly recommend this activity. So I want to kind of close out this webinar with talking a little bit about Rebel Scrum. So we think work can be fun. If you believe work can be fun and deliver value, we want to work with you. So come to rebelscrum.site/scrum-training and sign up for any one of our public classes, or shoot me an email if you're interested in a private class. These are some of the classes that we teach, but visit our website and learn more about when you can participate. We do have a professional Scrum Master class coming up next week if you'd like to join us. Another way you can interact with Rebel Scrum is to sign up for our blog. We do send out a weekly email with tips in your inbox, with articles from everything about the Scrum Values, which we do have several articles on that topic, to how to create a point system, to how to stop pretending to be agile. So lots of great articles out on rebelscrum.site. And if you want to get those in your inbox weekly, I highly recommend that you sign up for our email distribution list. And that concludes today's webinar on the Scrum Values. And I just want to say thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your chats, your comments, your questions. I will be reaching out to you via email. If you did put your questions in the chat, I'll follow up with you and see if we can have those discussions about your questions. Thank you so much for your time. And Lindsay, I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary. And as Mary mentioned, there are a lot of questions that came in. So all of those will be shared with Mary, and she will address them after the session at some point. So please be patient, but they will all be shared with her so that they can be addressed. And as always, please check out the Scrum.org website for a bunch of free resources like this webinar to help you on your learning journey. And we also have digital learning paths on our website that you could check out as well. And this recording will be available at scrum.org/webcasts. So please check that out. And yeah, so thanks for attending, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and Scrum on.